Welcome to Summit Session number 12. My name is Danielle Sadler, and I'm the marketing director here at Adventure Nannies, and we're so happy to have you here with us today. As a biracial Black woman, I can say that the last several weeks have been truly overwhelming as we are all navigating the traumatic loss of George Floyd as we watch the Chauvin trial play out. We've witnessed the police killing of Daunte Wright, and most recently seen the video of Adam Toledo. And now more than ever, I'm so honored to share some tangible ways that we can work together to fight the inequitable systems that exist in our society. To that end, I am thrilled to introduce our incredible presenter, Henrietta Celestine, founder of Mama Let's Read. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Henrietta. Henrietta lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with her husband and their 3 small kids. She is a biracial Black mom sharing diverse children's books with positive Black, Indigenous, and people of color characters that her family loves. Prior to becoming a parent, Henrietta completed a master's degree in international multicultural education with a concentration in human rights education. Her goal as a community member is to do her part in eliminating inequities and cultural deficit narratives about BIPOC individuals. As a parent, it became quickly clear to Henrietta that all children's books with BIPOC characters did not portray characters positively, and many even perpetuated negative racial stereotypes. On one Black History Month, she decided to start sharing a different children's book every day featuring positive Black characters. After receiving enthusiastic support from friends and family, Henrietta decided to share these book reviews publicly and officially started Mama Let's Read. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you all to Henrietta.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to see all of your faces, some familiar and some new, or some that I've only seen online. So welcome. And as Danielle said, thank you so much for the warm introduction. And I just want to echo her sentiments that it's been a really heavy week on top of a heavy year as it relates to all of the racial injustice, both in all, the entire BIPOC communities, and especially in the Black communities and Latino communities this last week. And it's been really heavy, especially as a Black parent with 3 Black children. Every time something happens, I just think about my children, and it's heartbreaking. And especially knowing that Daunte was calling his mom is just a lot. So I come to you after a heavy week, but I'm really excited to talk to you all, and I look forward to hearing from you all. And if you have any questions, as Danielle said, I'm more than happy to answer questions towards the end. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'm Henrietta. I'm going to talk about BIPOC kids' books, Windows and Mirrors. And I think that, let me see here. Just to get started, because people are coming from various backgrounds of learning, I did want to just have a couple of terms and acronyms to make it super clear what I'm talking about. So I use BIPOC a lot, which, as Danielle said, means Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Sometimes I might use POC as well, which is the previous term, which was people of color. And then I'm also going to touch on anti-racism. And for the topic, or for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to use Ibram Kendi's definition, which is the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it, and then dismantle it. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So why is reading diverse books important? This is a question that I think about a lot. Obviously, I'm really passionate about kids' books. And even before I had kids, I was always really passionate about reading books. I'm just a bookworm. Most of the adult books I read right now are on audiobook, but I read a ton of kids' books every day, all day long with my kids. And as Danielle mentioned, sort of for me, what started this was that I was seeing a lot of books specifically on like Black kids' book lists that were recommended, and I received them and I was really appalled. So for me, when I think about, what is important, it's parenting, caregiving is all about activism. And I really appreciated this quote from Social Justice Parenting a few weeks ago that says, "Parenting is activism. What we teach in the privacy of our homes shows up in the public places of society." And that's really how I think about kids' books. Kids' books are such an important part of learning for kids, not only as far as, like learning how to read, learning how to talk, learning how to pronounce, but also about learning about the world and learning about society. And so all of those small moments that you're having with your kids, whether they're your kids or kids that you're taking care of, are ultimately going to show up in the public society. So I think that's, for me, how I always think about books is the beginning, right? We have so many conversations, we have so many interactions with our kids that sort of center or start with a book. And that's really activism. So I posted this morning, and this is a question I hear a lot, is sort of like, well, why is it important? And my question or response is always, is your bookshelf perpetuating white supremacy? And before I sort of unpack that, I did want to present what white supremacy is when I talk about it. So white supremacy is the belief that white people are a superior race and should therefore dominate society. And so when I think about kids' books, and the bookshelf is figurative, right? So whether it's the books at your home or the books that you're checking out or the books in your classroom or library, if all the books that you're reading only have white characters, then the kids that are reading those books or seeing those books see that only white people are important, right? Just like if all the books that are being read only have white main characters. Because I know that oftentimes people say, oh, I have diverse books, look at all these people in the background. And I'm like, but that's not enough, right? People of color shouldn't just be in the background. We should be main characters. We should be, the hero, be doctor. We should be the regular kid that's doing bath time with their parents. All of those stories are so important. So other questions that I like to ask people as far as the books that they're reading, both with their kids and also reading at home, for leisure, is, do all of the books that you're reading, do they all have people in professions that are white? And so I think this is a common theme that we see a lot in books, especially in books that were published long ago, where the doctor is always white, the dentist is always white, or Santa Claus is always white. And so things like that are subtle ways that you're teaching children, all children, whether they're white or BIPOC children, that only white people matter, only white people have these professions. And then a big thing I hear too, of course, is that, oh, well, we have diverse books, look at all these books about slavery and civil rights. And again, if you're reinforcing stories that only show BIPOC characters from a negative light or from sort of the hardship and the racial trauma that they've experienced, then you're doing your child a disservice, or the children that you're interacting with a disservice, because you're giving them a very narrow view of how to see the world. And we live in the Bay Area, which is relatively diverse. Everything is relative. And I understand a lot of people live in other places where it's not as diverse. And so books might be the only way that they're being exposed to other cultures. And so I think one of the key things, especially, is if you're living somewhere rural where you don't have a ton of interactions with BIPOC people, and then you're only reading books that show BIPOC struggles and racial trauma, then that's all that your children are learning how to see when they look at BIPOC people. And for me, that's really sort of the crux of why I'm so passionate about this, is that when I think about activism, when I think about caregiving, I think about what are small action items that we can take. And so in the devastation of everything that's happening, I think about, what can I do with my kids in a small, specific way every single day to make sure that I'm not perpetuating white supremacy. And so for me, it's books. That's one way that I know I can be really mindful and really specific in teaching my children. And, I'm in a lot of mom groups, and people are always asking, oh, so-and-so is having a birthday, what should I get? And I'm always like, books, books, books. And for me, it's really important that my friends, regardless of their race, that they have diverse books from all BIPOC backgrounds. And so when my daughter, who's now my oldest daughter is 4.5, and when we first started getting invited to birthday parties, I was obviously going to get books. And my husband and I had a conversation, and one of our friends, her parents are Chinese American. And I was like, oh, let me find an amazing book with Chinese American characters. And my husband was like, oh, that's great, but let's give them a book with Black characters, because I'm sure that that's something that's out of their comfort zone that they're going to have less of. And so now I'm really mindful of that. So when we get invited to birthday parties, I think like, what is a book that I could give this family that they might not have at home or they might not be exposed to at home? So that's one way for me, sort of my activism in a small way. So as you all saw in the description of this presentation, one of the things that I wanted to talk about, a lot of you have probably heard mentioned before, is this concept in kids literature that books are like mirrors, windows, and glass sliding doors. And this is a super, super famous quote. It comes from a Black woman, the queen of multicultural kids lit, Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop. And she has this really famous essay that's called Mirrors, Windows, and Glass Sliding Doors. And what she talks about is that all children naturally gravitate towards books where they can see themselves. So a book as a mirror. And I know as an adult, I do that too. If I see a book that, and it doesn't even have to be like completely literal, but I grew up moving around a lot. And so any story that has a character where they're moving a lot and, starting fresh, to me, that really is something that I sort of seek out. And I'm like, oh, this looks really interesting. And my kids do the same thing, right? They look at a book, and my 2.5-year-old is really into construction. And so whenever he sees a book with construction, he's like, oh, there's a construction worker. That's me. Like, I am a construction worker. And so for me, it's always really important to make sure that I'm finding books with Black construction workers so that my son can literally see himself and not just see, oh, there's a white construction worker. The next part is windows. So for all kids, it's just as important to be able to see into other worlds. And some of those worlds are going to be familiar, but some of them are going to be, unfamiliar, and some of them are going to be strange. And that's a really important sort of way that kids' brains get to exercise their muscles and learn about the world. And a lot of times, going into a new experience is really intimidating. So I also, obviously, because I'm so passionate about books, I love to find books before we're going to have, a big, new experience. So pre-pandemic, my family and I love to travel. So I seek out a lot of books about traveling with families of color so that we can sort of, before we travel, we talk about, we're going to go to the airport, we're going to check in, we're going to do all of these things. And, some of those things are familiar and then some of them are strange. And that's really important on so many different levels so that your kids can start to understand and learn all of these things. The last concept is sliding glass doors. And this is literally a way to step into a new culture. And one of the books for my family that we love is Priya Dreams of Marigolds and Masala. And Meena Patel is a San Francisco Bay Area author. And the book specifically talks about India, specifically the region of Gujarat. And the big sort of theme is marigolds and how her grandmother misses India. And, one of the ways that she sort of holds India in her heart is through marigolds. And all of my kids really love the book, especially my oldest. And so my husband and I have both read it so many times. And we were walking around our neighborhood and we saw this beautiful garland of marigolds. And my husband was like, look, marigolds. And he was like, I would have never known what marigolds were if we hadn't read that book so many times. And so it's literally one of those things where, because we've been able to step into Gujarat Indian culture through this book, we as adults have learned so much. And we were like, oh, this family is probably from India. Maybe they're even from Gujarat. And, these are some of the things that they might be cooking at home. So like for kids and adults, it's so important and gives us this huge opportunity to step into another world, into another culture, even without physically doing so. And again, because we love to travel, that's really important to us for our kids, is to be able to expose them to all of these different cultures. And then hopefully one day when we can travel again, we can, go there and it won't be totally new. It'll be like, oh, I remember reading about this. And my daughter definitely does this. She sees marigolds and she's like, oh, it's like Priya, or it's, like some of the other books that we have with Latinx culture where marigolds are also really important. So that's why glass sliding doors, windows, and mirrors are so important. And that's really how I look at books for my kids and for all the kids that are in my life. Okay, discerning good books from bad ones. So this is a question I get asked a lot as well. And I think this is, of course, subjective. But these are some of the questions that I ask myself when I'm trying to sort of think about, is this a good book or a bad book? One of the recommendations I make, which is not always possible, is to read a book first. So before you read it to your child or read it to the child you take care of, is read it by yourself. And again, I realize it's not always possible, but when it is, I think that's a really important thing to do. So the first thing that I look at is like, who is the author? I type their name into Google. I'm curious. Let me see who this author is. Is this an own voices author? So depending on the context of the book, is this a book with BIPOC characters in it? Is the author BIPOC? Is the illustrator BIPOC? Is there cultural authenticity? So if it's a story about the queer community, is the author queer? Another thing, a big one, is when was the book published? And I'm sure most of you have seen a lot of the news this year and in other past years about authors that have published books, 40, 50, 60 years ago. And people are saying, well, these books are racist. And I agree. And that's a really important part of books. When you're looking at books that were published, a long time ago, the mentality and what was tolerated as far as racism is very different. And people are in different camps. I have very young children. So for me, if a book is racist, if an author has a racist past, it's not a book that I want on my bookshelf, and it's not a book that I want to read to my kids. When my kids are older, I will absolutely show them some of these books so that we can talk about it and we can, dissect why these books are problematic. But for my 2.5-year-old and my 4.5-year-old, my 6-month-old, like it's not useful. It's not something that I think at this age is going to resonate with them. So the books that we have that were published a long time ago, I always read with an extra critical lens and see, is there something in this book that is making me feel uncomfortable? And I think that's a really big thing as well, where I have books that I strongly dislike and that I do not recommend because they make me uncomfortable or they make my husband uncomfortable. That doesn't mean that that's the case for other people. There's other, Black people, Black families that might be like, I love this book. So I also think that you have to just sort of follow your instincts and be true to yourself and true to your family and your experiences. And if a book makes you feel uncomfortable, don't read it. You don't need to read it. There's so many amazing books out there. Some of the other questions that I ask myself as I look at books is, what is the message? What is the takeaway? And is it reinforcing negative stereotypes or messages? So just to expand on that, one of the books that I received when my oldest daughter was a baby was a book with all Black characters, and it was a counting book. And it literally had among the counting things were watermelons and fried chicken. And I was flabbergasted and appalled that this book was recommended. And I looked up the author, and the author was white, and I was like enraged. Because literally the takeaway for me as a Black parent is that this white author thinks it's appropriate that Black children should be counting watermelons and fried chicken because that's what Black people eat. So for me, that's like a really blatant, obviously, really blatant message that I'm not okay with. And I returned that book. But some of it is subtle, right? There's other books where maybe the illustrator is drawing the characters that are Black in sort of an uncomfortable way that I can't necessarily say like, oh, this is blatantly racist, but something about it is making me uncomfortable and is not what I want my children to see. Like, it's not a positive image. So I think that's also something that is important to think about, right? Not just the actual text, but also the illustrations. Are these illustrations that make you feel good? Are they going to make your children feel good? And then the last one that I always ask myself is the book written with appropriate language for the audience? So again, my kids are really young. So some of the books that we have, and I sort of put on a shelf for when they're older, because I know that some of the topics and some of the language that's used isn't something that is going to be appropriate for them, or maybe it's not something that I'm comfortable exposing them to or having conversations with them about. So a lot of it, I think, is really about yourself and trusting yourself. But I also think that some of these questions are things that are very easy to answer. And I'm always going to suggest finding books by BIPOC authors and illustrators. There are definitely books that I recommend that are written by white authors, that are illustrated by white illustrators. But I will tell you that I definitely have a much more critical eye of an author or illustrator that is describing or telling a story about BIPOC characters than I will if it's a BIPOC author or illustrator. And that's just the reality, right? We all live in a white supremacist world. And so we're all conditioned by these stereotypes that are often overt and sometimes they're not. So for me, those are the sort of key questions that I always ask as I decide, like, is this a good book? Is this not a good book? Is this a positive representation? Okay. With that, I wanted to share a few of our favorite books. So if you follow me, you've already seen some of these recommendations, but I wanted to give sort of a brief pinpoint of what I love about these specific books. So Thank You, Amu is an amazing book. The illustrations are really vibrant. It's done in sort of a collage way, and it's just a touching story about a woman who's cooking a stew, a Black woman who's cooking a stew, and the smell is just like so amazing. It is going out of her window and down the street. And so everybody in the neighborhood ends up coming to her door and asking, like, what is this amazing thing that you are cooking? And I love to cook. So a lot of my stories have cooking involved, just so you know. And so all of these people, come sort of one by one, and she's like, oh, I have enough to share. So she ends up sharing the stew with all of these people in her neighborhood. And then when it's finally dinner time for her, she sits down and she's so excited about her stew, and she realizes that her pot is empty. And she gets really sad. She's like, I made this amazing dish and I didn't even get to eat it. But then somebody knocks at the door, and it's all the people that she shared with, and they come bringing food for her, and they have this party in her apartment. And I just love this story. My kids love this story. I probably have it memorized because we've read it so much. But the characters in the book are all diverse. The main character is Black. A lot of the other sub characters are Black. There's a lot of different people that have different professions that are mentioned in the story, and they come from various different backgrounds. So that for me is one of my favorites. Anti-Racist Baby is another great book. And this one is less of a story, but it has really key points broken down for kids, babies, even adults, on how to be anti-racist. And as many of you know, anti-racism is a journey. And I love the way that Ibram Kendi breaks it down in this kid's book. And it's a book that I can read and learn something from myself. My kids can learn something from it. And it has awesome illustrations. So that one's definitely a winner. I already talked about Priya Dreams of Marigolds and Masala. Off to See the Sea. I love this book because it's this super imaginative story about a Black kid and his parents, or I should say their parents because it's not clear, their parents and their bath time ritual. And they're imagining that they're under the sea in the bathtub and there's all these creatures, and it's just a really sweet, simple story. And I want more of these kind of stories, right? So many of the books about BIPOC characters have something super, fantastical, or they're a hero and all of these things. And those are totally important. But I also want to be able to read my kids a story about bath time that they can see themselves in. I Dream of Popo is another just heartwarming story. I mentioned that I've moved around a lot. And so this story is specifically about a girl who moves from Taiwan to San Diego. And the whole sort of center of the story is about her relationship with her grandmother. And it's written really poetically. And it talks about how when she first comes to San Diego, she's struggling with her words. And then when she goes back to visit her grandmother, she's like, now I totally don't feel at home here. And I can totally resonate with that, having moved around so much. And so I really love the story. And I love that it showcases sort of that grandmother relationship. Another favorite in my house that my kids really love is When Aiden Became a Brother. I have 3 kids, so I've sought out a lot of books about welcoming a new sibling. And When Aiden Became a Brother is this great story about a child that is trans, and their parents have another child. Their parents tell them, we're going to have a baby. And Aiden is just so loving and so sweet. And Aiden's number one concern is like, is this child going to have a name that they love? Because I didn't love my name when I was younger, because I was given a girl name and I'm not a girl. And it's just this really amazing story that's done super well, that talks about the queer community. It has a Black family. The author that wrote it isn't Black, but is part of the LGBTQI community. And my kids loved reading it when I was pregnant, and even when I'm not pregnant. But it just has so many awesome messages. It's about welcoming a new sibling, but it's also about just like this unconditional love and like wanting your sibling to have this amazing experience and just be happy with who they are and be accepted from day one. Another really awesome book is We Are Water Protectors. This is an Own Voices book as well, that's written and illustrated by Indigenous women. And the story is awesome. But one of my favorite things about this is the illustrations. They're so beautiful. I just want to like frame them all and put them up in my kids' rooms. But it really does this beautiful metaphor of how, as a community, Indigenous people are working to protect water and why it's so important. And throughout the book, there's a snake that is the oil that they're trying to take from the land. And it's incredibly well done. All of my kids love it. And I love, as they get older, that we can sort of break down more of the literal aspects of the story. But now, while they're still little, we can talk about more of the sort of metaphor of what that means and how we work together as a community and things of that nature. All right, the last one I'll talk about is The Many Colors of Harpreet Singh. And the story is about moving, and the boy, the main character, Harpreet, is Sikh, and he moves what looks like from the Bay Area, because there's the Golden Gate Bridge in the background, and he moves to somewhere where there's snow. And the whole story is about how he has all of these emotions and he's really missing California. But beautifully woven through the story is sort of how he chooses the color of his patka depending on how he feels. And so he has all these different colors that are associated with his emotions. And when he moves, he's like, I only want to wear white because I just want to be invisible. But then in the end, he's living in this beautiful place that snows, and he ends up wanting to wear a white patka because it reminds him of the snow in the summer, and he misses the snow. And the colors are bright, it's vibrant, and it's just a really awesome story. I love it because it's also a great way to have conversations around like starting something new and maybe feeling uncomfortable and then making a friend. So there's a lot of different themes, but it also gives everyone an introduction into Sikh culture if that's not a culture that you're familiar with personally. All right. So next steps. I try to be action oriented, and especially given all of the events of this week, I really wanted to think about sort of what kind of takeaways I could give all of you at the end, sort of to summarize my presentation. And surprise, surprise, my number one is read more racially diverse books. The second is seek out BIPOC authors, illustrators, and educators. I think that, again, there's amazing books by white authors that have BIPOC characters, but ultimately it's so important to center and to pay and elevate BIPOC voices. And the stories that I love the most, like all the stories that I picked out, most of the stories I love the most are written by BIPOC authors, are illustrated by BIPOC illustrators. And I think that there's just a cultural authenticity that is there when it's an own voices story. And without it, it definitely changes the story. And sometimes stories are successful without it, but oftentimes they're not. And the last one is have important conversations with the kids in your care. So again, just to do a full circle, I really think of caregiving as activism, right? We are all our child's teacher, right? If you interact with a child, then you're teaching them, whether you're, a literal teacher or not, you are teaching them. The way that you respond to situations is teaching them. The way that you talk to other people is teaching them. The way that you remember people's names that you interact with is teaching them a lesson. And so I think that for me, part of the book recommendations are also to really spark conversations. If these are cultures that you're familiar with, great. Then your child gets to see, a mirror. But if not, then they get to have a window or a glass sliding door into a new world. So that is my presentation, and I hope that you have lots of questions because I would love to answer them.
Awesome. So I wanted to let everyone know, if you have a question, just because there's several of us in here, we want to make sure everyone's able to hear and kind of have a moment. Feel free to either type your question in the chat, or if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see the little smiley face with the plus sign that says reactions. And if you tap that, you can just raise your hand, and then we can have people speak one at a time. But if you don't want to speak directly, that's totally cool. Just feel free to leave your questions in the chat. Thank you so much, Henrietta. That was incredible. It's going to take me a little bit, I think, to absorb all of the information you just shared, but I really can't even tell you how much I appreciated that.
Thank you. There's so much information, and I tried to condense as much of it as possible. So I do hope that folks have questions, because I'm happy to go into more detail if people have questions.
So I did notice one person had a question about what do you do, or what is your recommendation if someone has been gifted a book that they don't feel is appropriate, or that has, some racist overtones. What do you do in that situation?
So it depends on the relationship that you have with the person gifting you the book. So for me, I generally see it as an opportunity to have a conversation. So I've had family members that have gifted us Dr. Seuss books, and that to me was a prompting of a conversation like, hey, did you know that Dr. Seuss was racist? You didn't? Let me show you some literature and that breaks down sort of why he was racist, why so many of his books are racist. And that for me was, it can be an awkward conversation, again, depending on your relationship. But for me, it was a very like, oh, I had no idea. And especially some of the family members that we have that are older, you grow up with books, right? And so you have an emotional attachment to a book. And so for a lot of people, Dr. Seuss was what everybody read. And so when they think of kids' books, they're like, oh, I'm going to get this book that I loved when I was a kid. So for me, I take it as an educational opportunity to have a conversation. But again, it depends on the relationship. I personally, if I am gifted a book that's horrible and I don't have a gift receipt, I recycle it.
Yeah.
I know that there's some people in the Bookstagram world that feel like, putting sort of a disclaimer in the book about what is racist about it and how to talk about it is useful. And I personally don't fall into that camp. I don't think that there's any benefit, especially with really young kids, in reading a book and 2 or 3 explaining to my kids that, hey, this book is racist, so we're going to read it, but this is why it's racist.
Right. I totally agree. And so just for folks that maybe are kind of taken aback about the information that Henrietta just shared about Dr. Seuss, there actually was kind of a large backlash that happened within the last few months. And one place you could go to check out to learn a little bit more about that is a website called The Conscious Kid. They're on Instagram and Facebook, and I really love a lot of the information that they share, but they've done a very thorough deep dive into Dr. Seuss and into the author, his racist past, and a lot of the really problematic things that he produced in his early years. So I think, it can be scary to realize that some of our, quote unquote heroes were very problematic. But I think that, as Henrietta mentioned, parenting and nannying, caring for young children, this is activism. And in so many ways, by protecting them from these harmful ideologies, we are really setting up our society for a much more equitable future. So I do have some more questions here for our amazing audience. So we've got a question here that says, I have kids who are growing into chapter books. Do you have a good resource for chapter books written by BIPOC authors?
That's a great question. So I haven't found an amazing resource that specifically focuses on chapter books. I am definitely starting into the chapter books more now that my child is sort of ready for those. The book that comes to mind right now, there's a 2-book series that's called, the first one's called Dragons in a Bag, and the second one is called Dragon Thief. And I've reviewed the first one. If you look at Mama Let's Read on Instagram, I haven't reviewed the second one yet, but they're written by a Black author whose name I can't remember off the top of my head right now, but they're really amazing. They take place in New York, and they have some sort of like fantasy aspects with dragons and magic. So that's the first book that comes to mind. I think that there is definitely a need for more chapter books by BIPOC authors, especially for sort of like early readers. I think there's starting to be a lot more books in sort of the middle grade and like young adult books that are really awesome. But I feel like as far as like sort of the early readers, like, first through fifth, sixth grade, there's definitely less BIPOC books that I have come across so far. But as I come across them, I'll share those.
Okay, awesome. We have a comment here from one of our viewers who mentioned that there's a website/organization called We Need Diverse Books that has some chapter book recommendations. So that might be interesting to check out. We Need Diverse Books. If you just Google that, you might be able to find some resources. We also have somebody who would like to speak up. Aori, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you here if you'd like to ask your question.
Hey, this is so great and so timely. I was actually just struggling yesterday with storybooks for my son. He's 19 months old, and he loves to read. And as I was looking just for new books, just so many of them had like racial trauma at its center, and I don't want to teach him racial trauma. So I've definitely been using your resources, your Instagram, Mama Let's Read. And I did want to share one other book that he really loves. It's called Full of Hugs. And it's just about a little boy who visits his grandma, and she's cooking and he's hungry. And it's just talking about all the great things at his grandma's house. And it's just really beautiful. So I just really want more books like that. So I've been using your resource, and thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks, Aori. It's called Full of Love. We have that book as well. And it's a really awesome story. It also centers around sort of Sunday dinner at his grandmother's house. So that one's really awesome. And I think you're totally right, Aori. I think that there's such a need for books that don't have racial trauma in them. And that's one of the reasons why I really like the Seed of the Sea. I don't know if you saw that recommendation yet, but that, like, my 2.5-year-old is like really, really into that book. That's just super sweet.
That's amazing. Oh, that's so cool. And I love to hear people that have been learning so much from your website and from your social media, Henrietta. I think one thing I would really love to encourage everyone here is to find Mama Let's Read online and give them a follow. It's just quickly become one of my favorite things to see each day on the internet, because there are so many incredible recommendations and thoughtful book reviews. And we've got one other question here from a viewer that is, how can I help my friends and family diversify their reading selections?
That's a great question. So I think it depends on, again, relationship wise. So for me, I like to share, some of my friends that have kids that are similar ages. I will just share, like, hey, I just checked this book out from the library, or I just got this book and it's so amazing. I think, your kids would really like this book. So that's one way to do it. And the other way to do it is to gift them books, for special occasions, whatever, birthday and holidays and things like that. And one way, especially too, with family wise, if you are asking, for gifts for your kid and you put together sort of a book wish list, that then sort of sparks other people to, oh, maybe my kids would like this book as well. So those are some of the ways that I sort of try to be proactive about it. And then I think also having conversations, right? So which depends on the relationship that you have, but I think having these conversations is really important. And if you're not having the conversations, then you're not really giving people an opportunity to learn. So I'm definitely a direct and sort of blunt person. So for me, I really like to just have a conversation about it and say, hey, I've noticed that a lot of your books have characters that look the same. Have you ever thought about, adding more books with different characters, especially BIPOC characters? These are some of the books that I really like.
I love that. That's really helpful. I think that's a really great recommendation. So next, we have Debbie, who has a question, and I'm going to unmute you here, Debbie. We'd love to hear from you.
Hi, that was so helpful. It's not really like a question, it's kind of a commentary that, for us, I found your framework for like assessing books really helpful, because it occurred to me that like as an outsider to the Black community, I don't really have a good sense of like what like for you when you're saying like something feels like a little bit off. And I was thinking about when you were talking about like that watermelons and like fried chicken thing, because for me it's like a lot of Asian books center around Asian food, right? And so like to me that would have been like, oh, like that's a positive representation, like we want to see this. And then I know like in the foodie world there's this whole like reclaiming like Southern food to be like all the stuff that you think of Southern foods actually like our food that you've appropriated. And so I guess kind of, do you feel like as long as we're looking at authors that are kind of own voices authors, that solves that problem? Or like, how do you as an outsider to the community know if you're like accidentally, kind of perpetuating harm?
That's an excellent question. And I don't think that there is a black and white answer to that question, but I think that the biggest thing I think is having conversations and learning. And so, some of the other resources that were mentioned, like the Conscious Kid, and there's another one, I think it's called Here We Read, and, We Need Diverse Books. I would just say that for me personally, while I would say like 90% of their recommendations are recommendations I agree with, there are maybe 5 or 10% of their books that I personally don't agree with or don't read with my kids. And part of that is sort of the own voices framework. So there are, for example, there's a book that's really well loved that's written by a cis white gender woman that's about a Black sort of genderqueer child that everybody recommends. And the reason that I don't recommend it is because I've had conversations and have gotten very specific feedback and sort of have researched that a lot of people in the LGBTQI community don't like the book. And they really feel like the author is sort of taking up space in a world that she has no cultural authenticity in. And so I think about the same thing with food, where, I think there's books that I really like. And the first thing I look at, so I am obviously not Asian. And so for books that have Asian characters that talk about food, the first thing I do is like look at who the author is and also look at who the illustrator is. And then I also might do a search and see if there's any negative reviews of the book. And just to be more aware, since I'm not Asian, is there something that I'm missing in this book that I don't have the lens to identify? So, it's a lot of heavy lifting if you're really invested in picking the right books, right? And that's also why I say, like, I think it's important to read the book as an adult first before you read it with your child, because I've definitely had moments where we got a new book and I was like, oh yeah, let's read the book. And then I was like, oh, this is not, this is not actually something I feel comfortable with. And again, there's so many degrees where there's books that, talk about, so for me, another big pet peeve that I personally don't recommend books with is books that talk about skin color like food. And a lot of people are totally, on board with that. I personally don't like that because I feel like it just opens up sort of the floodgate for teasing for kids. If you start to sort of say it's okay to compare, so-and-so skin to chocolate and to cinnamon, then I'm like, it's really easy to say, oh, well, your skin is brown and it looks like poop.
Right.
So for me, those are reasons why I personally don't recommend those books, because again, when you look at messaging and when you think about from a child's perspective, to me, I think you're sort of saying it's okay to compare people's skin color to food if you're reading those books. And then it's a slippery slope, right? So, well, I can compare it to food, then I can compare it to other things like mud and poop and, plants. So for me, that's where I personally just sort of try to navigate it by really like digging into who the author is, who the illustrator is, and seeing if the community has said anything about it.
I love that. I think that the advice that you've just shared to do the legwork that, is more time consuming and it is an investment of your time, but I think it's so meaningful to say, okay, before I present this book to a child that I'm caring for or to my own child, I'm not only going to, make sure that the person who is writing and illustrating this book is someone who is a member of the community they're representing, but I'm also going to maybe do a Google search and read through a couple different articles and purposefully be searching to see, is there some sort of negative feedback about this book from the community that it represents? Because I think as with so many things in life, it's so vital that we really listen to the people who are being represented and believe them. And, sometimes, like Debbie mentioned, I may not necessarily understand certain aspects of another culture that maybe would be problematic, but it is my responsibility to do my due diligence and research and try to figure out those areas of those blind spots in my own internalized biases, and make sure that as I'm presenting information to children, especially, that I've investigated all areas around the people who are producing that content, so that I make sure that I'm sharing something and bringing something into the kids' lives that will be uplifting and grounding and will provide them with the opportunity to learn more about themselves and more about the world. So we've got a few more comments here. Sophia mentioned, I like Lee and Lowe for finding diverse books.
Yeah, and sorry, to add on to that point, I was gonna sort of expand on that. I agree. Lee and Lowe is really awesome for books. So one great way to find other books is to look at publishers of the books that you like. And so Lee and Lowe is very specific in publishing books by BIPOC authors. Another really great small publishing house is called Flamingo Rampant, and they're the company that published When Aiden Became a Brother. There's also a newer press called Wheat Penny. I think it's Wheat Penny Publishing Press that's owned by a biracial Black woman, and her whole agenda is also to specifically publish books by BIPOC authors. So Flamingo Rampant, and I can type it into the chat too. They're a small publishing house, and they specifically focus on books for BIPOC authors, and also by people in the queer community. And so they have a really great lens, and we have a couple of their other books that I've been really happy with as well.
That's amazing. So I did want to share a really helpful comment from one of our viewers. Michelle mentioned, I really appreciate the note about gifting books that centers a culture or something that may not be familiar to a family. Some of the most awkward gifts we've gotten are books that include Asian people but are problematic. Definitely an intent misaligned with impact. And I have also experienced that. And I think it's really important to kind of add on to Henrietta's point that, going out of your way to do research about a book that will be an amazing addition to a family's bookshelf, and purposefully trying to, like Henrietta said, bring in information that maybe isn't going to be something that they're regularly seeing. So I think that's such a great opportunity to bring in a different perspective, a different cultural experience through these books. And what an amazing way to gift to somebody you care about, or a friend or family. And I love that.
And one thing to add on to that thought is also, like, I like to gift books that my kids really love, right? So especially if we're doing like a birthday party or a cousin or, somebody's celebration, I like to ask my kids, what's one of your favorite books right now? What is a book that you think that they would enjoy? And so that's one way that I also try to sort of continue the conversation around books with my kids, is like, oh, you are, so I shared recently Nana Akua, which is a book about a young girl who goes to school, and for Grandparents' Day, she brings her grandmother, who's from Ghana. And my father-in-law is from Ghana, and my daughter has been wanting to read this book for every occasion. So we've been reading it like 3 times a day. So I know if we have any, gifts to give in the near future, and I ask her, like, what book do you want to give? It's going to be that book. So that's also a really nice way to sort of diversify your friends and family's bookshelves, is by giving them a book that resonates with you or resonates with your child.
That's really great. That's such helpful. I think that's such a helpful detail too, because by doing that, you're also strengthening the bond between, your children and their children, to have this kind of different topic to understand and to read together. and to then be able to kind of share in the experience of what they thought and felt about that book. I think that's really cool.
And sorry, I just thought of one other thing as you were saying that. So one of the things that I do as well is whenever my kids are in educational settings, and when I look at sort of like preschools or schools in general, I always look at their libraries and I always look at their books. And I always ask the teachers if they'd be open to book donations, because it's so important, right? And obviously we know our school system has huge challenges, and finances are definitely one of them. And so I like to think of like, what are a few books, obviously depending on your budget, like is there, you know, 1 or 2 books that are so impactful to your child that you could donate to their classroom that will sort of give them an opportunity to connect with other kids in the classroom, and that other kids can then have sort of a window into their world and something that's meaningful to them. And so especially for my children, I just think, you know, going into so many settings where they're, you know, one of few Black children, I think it's so important that they have books where they can see themselves on the bookshelves. And I always also advocate that they get rid of any Dr. Seuss books.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that is so incredibly helpful. Thank you so much, Henrietta. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate your time. You know, this has been such a difficult couple of weeks, and honestly, longer than that. But I really appreciate you for taking the time to invest in creating this incredible presentation for us, and to all of the hard work that you're doing with Mama Let's Read to bring these incredible books and reviews to so many different people online. And I just want to tell you how much of an impact you've had on me personally. And I'm just so grateful for you and for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to have this presentation today. It's been a lot of fun for me as well. I think about so many of these things so often. And so it's been also fun for me to sort of put it all together and share it with all of you.
Well, we are so grateful. And, you know, to our viewers, I want to let you know that we will be having a wrap-up blog post on adventurenannies.com that will share a lot of the resources that Henrietta has touched on here throughout this conversation. We do have a blog post up already that talks a little bit about this session that has some of the resources that were mentioned. So be sure to check out our blog post for more info, but absolutely go and check out Mama Let's Read on every social media platform. Check out the website and definitely follow them, and you'll be able to see so many incredible recommendations on such a regular basis. And in addition to book reviews that provide so much insight, it really kind of changes your perspective about so many of these books. So thank you again to Henrietta. And I wanted to let you all know, if you want to mark your calendars, our next summit session is going to be happening on May 8th. We'll be discussing conscious parenting with Sarah Sticklin. So I just want to say thank you again from all of us at Adventure Nannies. Thank you for your time. And thank you again to Henrietta. I hope you all have a really wonderful rest of your weekend.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.